This is a conversation with Kenneth Pollack about one single question. Why do militaries of Arab nations, despite often having superiority in numbers and better equipment than their opponents, tend to hugely underperform in modern military conflicts, and often end up losing wars which, in theory, they should win? It's a question that has been asked by many, but no one knows more about it than my guest. Kenneth spent over 3 decades as an analyst in the CIA, where he studied militaries of both U.S. partners and adversaries. And after leaving the CIA, he became an academic and dedicated his academic career to answering this question. And so this is what we talk about. What is the reason that Arab militaries tend to be notoriously ineffective? How does their culture, politics, or economy influence how they fight? Or why do organizations like Hezbollah seem to defy this rule? And why are they more effective than many larger and better equipped traditional Arab armies? The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And if you want to see the whole episode ad-free and sooner than anyone else, and if you want to ask questions to my guest, you can also join the generous supporters on my Patreon, who help me to make this happen. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So, I want to talk about the topic that you've focused a big part of your professional career on, and that you wrote several books on, and that you're, I would say, a leading authority on, which is the topic of Arab militaries and their performance. But maybe before we get to that, could you maybe talk a little bit about your own professional background on this topic and how you actually got to thinking and writing and researching this issue?
Sure. So I started out my career as one of the Persian Gulf military analysts at the CIA. I was there from the late 1980s, right after the end of the Iran-Iraq War, up into the early 1990s. I was at the middle of the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91, and had a tremendous experience then, and obviously got to see the Iraqi military very much in action. And how I got into this topic, I actually remember the moment. So it was after the Persian Gulf War, and I had been the lead author of the CIA's huge post-mortem on Iraqi military operations and strategy during the war. And I finished that, put it to bed. I don't know if it had been published yet, but it was certainly in the works. And I was sitting down and I was reading a paper written by one of the Syria military analysts at the agency. He said some things about Iraq, so I had to sign off on it, for coordination purposes. And what was fascinating to me was, he went through all of their order of battle and equipment, et cetera. And then it came to various qualitative issues, human factor issues. And he started describing all of the problems that the Syrians had. And I was shocked because they were absolutely identical to the problems that the Iraqis had. All right, absolutely identical. I remember sitting there thinking to myself, what's going on here? Is this, a problem of they have similar political systems? Is it the economic systems? Is it the culture? Is it something else? What's going on here? Is it the fact that both have some reliance on the Soviet military, although the Iraqi reliance on the Soviet military was always wildly exaggerated. But again, they had some experience of the Soviets. What was going on here? And that set me off reading all kinds of other things. And I discovered, my God, the Egyptians have the same set of problems. The Libyans have the same set of problems. And when I went off to grad school at that point in time, I went to get my PhD on leave from the agency. This was something that I wanted to dig into in great depth. And so I wrote a very long-term paper on it first, and then it became the basis of my doctoral thesis, which then became the 2 books, Arabs at War and Armies of Sam.
So I think if we're going to be talking about the topic that, you dedicated the books to, which is why Arab militaries tend to underperform militarily in conflict, or a different way to put it, more succinctly, why Arabs lose wars, as is the famous phrase. But maybe before we get to why that is, I'd like to talk for a little bit about the assumption itself, because um, it is talking about quite a large number, as you've mentioned, quite a large number of states that are quite different from each other, and the conflicts they participated in are also different. So there is a risk of maybe making statements that are maybe too generalized or sort of blanket statements. So maybe a good way to start would be to talk a little bit about that. Do we have actually any data on how successful or unsuccessful Arab militaries actually are, or what led you to the belief that they are actually comparatively very unsuccessful in modern conflicts?
Sure. So I'm not sure exactly what kind of data you would be looking for. I, looked over the kind of universe of Arab military experiences since 1945. I'll be honest with you, I can't remember exactly how many cases I looked at. It's scores. I think there was something like 80 or 90 different conflicts that Arab military forces have been involved in since 1945. I've actually got it in my book, Armies of Sand. And I come to qualitative assessments of how they performed in each one. My ultimate judgments are very much in line with pretty much every other military historian who's looked at these conflicts, both individually and then again in the very rare cases where people have looked at them comparatively. But I'm one of the only people who really has looked across the entire universe of cases. What I would say is, I'll put this: you can always say that a broad statement is overgeneralized, right?
Mm.
It's inevitable that you're going
Yeah.
to do so. That said, since 1945, you use the key word. It's the one of the words that I use as well, which is that since 1945, Arab militaries have very consistently underperformed. There have been wars that they've won, right? Which is why I actually don't like the whole "why do Arabs lose wars?" because they have won wars. The Iraqis famously did defeat the Iranians. There have been wars that they fought against each other, and somebody had to win and somebody had to lose. But what we see very consistently from one case after another is how they underperform, how they don't do as well as you would have expected based on primarily material considerations, what the balance of equipment was, what the balance of manpower was, what the balance of other forms of power were. Right? When you look at these wars, just at a gross level, the Arab states tend to punch below their weight. In addition, when you do start going in case by case, and this is why I've been working on this for over 35 years. When you start looking by case, what's really fascinating is how even when they are winning, they typically have to find workarounds around certain problems, which are just endemic to individual armies and actually across the universe of cases. Again, you need to be careful. Different Arab militaries at different times have done some things better, some things worse. Some militaries get better over time, some get worse over time. There are some militaries that do some military operations better consistently, worse military operations consistently. Right? So there is a wide range. But by and large, the most consistent trend has been these problems and how they have created underperformance, punching below their weight. Last point I'll make on this is that, I look very, very hard in all of my work at the exceptional cases, at instances where Arab militaries did better than the norm, where they improved over previous military experiences, or where you can simply look at them and say, these guys are doing better than all these other Arab militaries in all these other cases, many of them quite similar. So there is variance, right? It's not, kind of just uniformly disastrous. And I find those exceptional cases to be the most interesting and the most informative by far, right? It's why I've got many chapters in my work that look just at these exceptional cases, whether it's a group like Hezbollah fighting Israel in the 1980s and 90s, or again in the Syrian civil war, the Jordanian military back in 1948, the Iraqi Republican Guard, right? There are a number of these cases where the Arab states or Arab militaries do better. And they're the most interesting, they're also the most informative because they shed light both on what the problems are. And of course, for me as an American, one of the major considerations I've had in doing all of this work is that because so many Arab states are now allies of the United States, I've been looking to try to help the US military improve the performance of our Arab allies in hope that they'll be able to defend themselves and we no longer will have to.
I agree that your point and your take is a lot more nuanced than I made it sound like, but I think it's good to sort of get this out of the way first.
Sure, absolutely.
For everyone listening. But let's dive into the question of why. And I want to talk about all the factors and aspects individually. But to start with, overall, after looking at this for 35 years, in your view, what are the most important factors that all or most Arab militaries and nations tend to have in common that you consider to have the most impact on their performance and why they tend to underperform?
Sure, Dominic. And I know you are going to jump into this and we'll talk about it in more detail. But I will give you the top lines. But they're big topics. They're, generalizations themselves. So I'm always a little bit reticent to use these big terms. But you asked, and we'll get into the details in a little bit, so I'll give them to you. So I think there are, broadly speaking, three different sets of factors that have contributed to this consistent military effectiveness, lack of military effectiveness, or military underperformance that we've seen from Arab armed forces over the decades. One is issues related to economic underdevelopment, right? And again, a big, broad topic, but a persistent one across the Arab world. Second one is the political dimension, the fact that virtually all of the Arab states throughout the post-1945 era have been autocracies of one kind or another, right? Either monarchies or what we used to euphemistically refer to as republics, but really are military dictatorships. But again, all of them autocracies of one kind or another. And that those autocratic political systems bring another set of issues with them. And then finally, and I found most important of all, are a set of behavioral patterns associated with the traditional Arab culture. Right? Again, this is all very, very dangerous kind of stuff to kind of, just throw out there at this level. And we'll get into it, I know. But broadly speaking, it is those behavioral patterns that are driven by these traditional cultural patterns that have been the most problematic for the Arabs, although also in some cases, actually the most beneficial as well.
Well, I wanted to maybe just to follow up on what you said in the very end, because was kind of caught by surprise. What do you mean, or in which instances it was beneficial?
Sure. So, and again, I want to be careful here because as I think you're aware, I've written literally thousands of pages on this. I try to be very, very careful, especially when I'm talking about culture, to be very precise. But we don't have time for me to read thousands of pages. So I'm going to have to be a little bit over the top and a little bit broader. There are a lot of patterns associated with Arab culture that speak to kind of martial bravery, right? Which we see in a number of Arab wars. One of the slurs that you often hear against Arab militaries is they're a bunch of cowards and they run away. And, there certainly are instances of that. I mean, heck, every country's military history has instances of cowardice, of units running away, of entire armies breaking and running. That's not something unique to the Arabs. What's actually striking is, especially in the modern world, how many occasions there were when Arab formations, hung together, fought incredibly hard in circumstances where you would have expected them to break and run. And that also leads to, that's in part of another very big benefit that they seem to get from these cultural patterns, these ways of thinking and behaving, which is very strong unit cohesion. Or I'll put it slightly differently, which is that Arab culture has a tremendous emphasis on in-group loyalties. And again, I'm being kind of gross in my generalizations here, but as a general rule, very, very strong bonds of loyalty. And where you get those bonds working in military formations, where you get units that take on the aspects of an Arab family, an Arab clan, an Arab tribe, right? Where the officers behave the way that traditional leaders in those kinds of social systems would behave, where the men see themselves as bound by these ties, you then can get tremendously strong unit cohesion. And you will get units that are completely surrounded, militarily, their day is done. They are never going to win. And yet they will fight like tigers until they're eventually killed off. Now, what you can also get, the flip side of that, is where you don't get those bonds. If you get a unit where people don't feel that sense of connection, then they got nothing. Right. Then they're not interested, in one another's well-being whatsoever. And so you often get unit cohesion in, even within Arab armies, heck, even within, our divisions and brigades, where, one subunit will have tremendously strong unit cohesion because it does take on these aspects of of our cultural unit, and others that have no unit cohesion whatsoever and will disintegrate upon contact. Right. But a lot of it is about that. As I said, in many instances, they really can take advantage of that unit cohesion, of that emphasis on martial bravery to fight harder than you might expect. I mean, a great example of this is the Iraqi Republican Guard during the Persian Gulf War, during Operation Desert Storm, when they fought extremely poorly, right? They were wiped out by American forces and, wiped out handily, entire divisions being destroyed for the loss of, 2 or 3 American armored vehicles. And again, even the Republican Guard just fighting really badly, but they fought unbelievably hard. Right. And there are just any number of stories from the American side of, an M1 putting a sabot round through a tank. The round comes out, then kills a BMP behind it. And yet whoever the survivors of the BMP, stumble out of the back of the vehicle and charge the American tanks with Kalashnikovs and RPGs. And of course, they have no hope of doing any damage to this phalanx of American armor moving up on them. And they nonetheless keep fighting until they are machine gunned down or run over by the American tanks. And those, I'm not telling just one story. That's a model that, American soldiers repeated in any number of instances all across the fighting on the 25th, 26th, and even 27th of February, 1991.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. I want to get back to the culture later because it is the most complex factor out of the three. But let's start with the economy first, because I think that's also extremely interesting, because in many ways it's quite contradictory or seemingly contradictory. Because if economy is, and that may be an option for you to expand this idea further, but if economy is a factor, then you would maybe expect that today we do have a number of Arab states that have enormous amount of money at their disposal, and they have been using it to invest heavily in their militaries, buying the best Western equipment money can buy and buying Western advisors to train their militaries. When talking about the Gulf nations, for example. But then again, when they tried to use that in combat, in military operations, like in Yemen, for example, they have underperformed yet again quite significantly. So how that maybe the question is the economic factor really that important if even in cases when it doesn't apply, it doesn't seem to help that much?
Sure. Great question. Let me answer it in this way. So first, um, it's less economics in the gross sense of GDP per capita or how much money do you have. Right. The real issue that the Arabs experienced, the real set of problems that they experienced related to economics, broadly speaking, were, as I said before, about underdevelopment. Right. I mean, the easiest, simplest way to put it is that the Industrial Revolution more or less skipped the Arab world. Right. They never really experienced it. And so from the period of 1945 up until the early 21st century, what you saw was a lot of problems derived from that. So, first, there was a set of problems related to the manpower pool itself. You had low literacy rates for much of this period of time. You frankly had high numbers of health issues, right? So you rejected large numbers of soldiers from the available pool of manpower because they had health issues of one kind or another, or physical deformities of one kind or another. So you're reducing the manpower pool available to you from which you're able to draw. And then, on the other side, as mentioned, if you've got issues with literacy, et cetera, this has huge ramifications in terms of information flows, in terms of the ability to teach and to learn, right? All kinds of issues. Beyond that, though, the bigger set of problems, truthfully, for underdevelopment was the lack of familiarity with equipment. Right? So the Industrial Revolution is all about these wonderful machines from telephones and radios to trucks to tanks to aircraft. Right? And what you found was that all across the Arab world for the entirety of the second half of the 20th century, but to a certain extent on into the early 21st century, Arab societies just had much fewer numbers of these machines than more developed societies, certainly than Western societies or the more developed East Asian societies, or even, and I looked at all kinds of different countries all over the world, South American countries, a whole variety of others. So the average Arab soldier, the average Arab officer coming to the military did not have the same familiarity with how these machines worked. They didn't work with them on a regular basis when they were young. They didn't necessarily have a car. They didn't necessarily have a TV in their house. They didn't necessarily have even something as simple as like a sewing machine. Right? And so the understanding of how you use these machines to their optimal level of performance, how you maintain them so that they don't break down, and then how do you repair them once they have broken down was often alien to them. Right? And so as a result of it, what you saw, especially in the late 20th century, but again, to a certain extent on into the early 21st, was just an inability of the average Arab soldier or officer to take full advantage of what weaponry did, what machinery did for industrial age warfare. And that, went beyond the simple, you had tank crews that couldn't fight a tank to its maximum ability, right? If you put them in an M1 tank, you didn't get the same performance out of that M1 tank that you would from an American crew in literally the same tank. Or if you put an Arab pilot in an F-16, they would not perform as well as an American pilot in an F-16. But it went beyond that to, much of industrial age warfare was about the interaction of all of these different machines, right? Ultimately, that's what combined arms warfare is in the industrial era. How do you get armor to work in conjunction with artillery? How do you get them ground forces to work in conjunction with air forces, with helicopters and fixed wing aircraft, right? Understanding what the machines do and how they do it was absolutely critical to performance in warfare. And so this problem of underdevelopment, of not understanding fully how to employ these machines. And then, as I said, how to maintain them and how to repair them. And you saw this over and over and over again, still to this day, incredibly low operational readiness rates among Arab militaries, huge problems with basic repair where equipment had to be repaired at much higher levels, right, depot level, as opposed to in most Western militaries where the same level of repair could be done out in the field. Right, so this was a huge set of issues for underdevelopment that had a variety of different impacts on Arab militaries. The exception where your points about the Gulf states, what's interesting about that, a few things. First of all, of course, the Gulf states were just, even though they had lots of money and in many cases bought lots of machinery, what you saw was in many cases they did no better than the other Arab states. First, again, they're coming from the same societies. Even if they get this stuff, they're often first generation using it. They don't quite know how to use it. What's more, because of all the money, they could afford not to maintain it properly. They could afford not to repair it properly. In many cases, they could afford to not even use it. They would hire someone to use it for them. And, whether that's domestic help in the home or, far more importantly, in the military, where they would often have foreign technicians to do so much of this stuff for them, even to the extent of, many of the Arab militaries would have, would bring in Pakistanis or Indians or Brits or French to fly their combat aircraft for them because they couldn't do it as well. Right, so that was one set of issues for them. And the Gulf states will be the first ones to say they also have very big problems as a result of all the money with worker productivity and just kind of, a willingness to actually do this kind of labor, which is also problematic in all of the Gulf states. Right, but what's also important to think about, and I think your question gets at this, is where the Arab states have been going. Right, which is we're now coming out of the Industrial Revolution and we're now at the beginning of the information revolution, the information age. And increasingly, the critical weapons of war are information age weapons. And, there, as I said, the industrial age skipped the Arab world. The information age isn't. Right. When you go to the Arab world, when you go to the Middle East, they all have multiple cell phones. There are many great hackers in the Arab world, right? They are very, very conversant with many of the tools, at least the ones we have now, of the information age. And, first, I expect that this is going to help them overcome some of those problems, right? And they'll be able to exploit these technologies in ways that they really couldn't exploit industrial age technologies. And you're already starting to see that, right? I'm just back from a trip to the region, was, up in Lebanon. I was actually down in Gaza. I was at any number of conversations with Israeli military officers, right? Hezbollah in particular, but to a certain extent, Hamas as well, are able to take advantage of these information age technologies, right? They've got a faculty with them that they simply didn't have when it came to tanks and jet fighters and 20th century weaponry, right? They can do all kinds of things. And again, the Israelis are superb as well. And, they typically do win these fights, but they're much harder fights. And the Israelis really have to stay on their toes. And they regard in particular Hezbollah as a very formidable adversary, in part because of their ability to take advantage of the 21st century technology in a way that they just couldn't with the 20th century technology.
Can you maybe give some examples of this from the ongoing conflict, either on Hamas or Hezbollah side?
Well, sure. I mean, first, very obviously, the ability of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah to employ drones, right? Which again, the drones are pieces of equipment, no question about that. And the Israelis do seem to be better able to employ the drones, but especially with the tactical drones, which are very, very simple systems. Hezbollah and Hamas fighters have nonetheless been able to use them in very sophisticated ways in terms of spoofing, in terms of information collection, in terms of misdirecting the Israelis. And again, this is all about how you use information warfare to confuse your adversary, gain advantages over your adversary. Right? There are also constant cyber fights. Right? The Israelis, as they're going into combat at very tactical levels, right, are worried about Hezbollah in particular trying to mount cyber operations against their formations as they're going into these operations, into these different offensives. So again, this is a way of taking advantage of where 21st century economies in the grossest sense of the world are moving toward. And again, how much of this is hardware, how much of it's software, and there's definitely a hardware component. And again, you mentioned the Yemenis, right? The Houthis. In many ways, the Houthis live in the 12th century, but they're able to assemble and program some fairly sophisticated Iranian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles. Right? They've done some very interesting things with them. And again, we can say it's probably only a small number of elite technicians, but nonetheless, they've got them. And they're able to do these sorts of things. And again, in societies that have greater connectivity with the developed world, with the advanced technology, like Hezbollah, to a certain extent, like the Palestinians more broadly, you're going to see more and more of that.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. And now, back to the conversation. Let's move to the second factor that you've mentioned, which is the issue of lack of democracy, or that a large number of the Arab nations have some form of autocratic regime in place, which does negatively impact their military performance. And you make a number of arguments for why specifically that should be, whether it's that the militaries are being used for internal purposes, that they have to be kept weakened so they don't pose a threat to the regime. But one thing that I keep thinking about is that, at least in theory, every dictatorship or autocratic regime should face similar challenges. So if that's true for the Arab states, then wouldn't that be true for any kind of autocracy, including Russia or China, for example, and that any autocracy or dictatorship should perform by definition worse than a democracy should?
Sure. This is a great topic. And let me start here, Dom. When I first came at this topic, right, as I said, in the early 1990s, again, this is one of the things I wanted to explore. It just was obvious to me, right? All of the Arab states were autocracies. And, especially looking at a place like Iraq, where you hear all the time, everyone is scared to think for themselves because they're afraid that Saddam will kill them for doing so. Right? You hear this all the time. And so I wanted to explore that. Now, I will tell you, at that time, there was nothing out there. I mean, nothing. People had spoken about politicization of militaries, poor civil-military relations for the longest time, but there really was nothing on how this would affect military effectiveness. I mean, I had to put this together, out of whole cloth. And I did that in my dissertation. And then a number of other people came along, read my dissertation, Jim Quinlivan being the most important of them, right? Jim wrote this very famous piece called about coup proofing, right? Which is more or less taking one variant of politicization that I had talked about. And I know Jim cites my dissertation in his article, and he and I actually had a conversation about this before he went ahead and read it. But he chose to focus on this one piece, and he did come up with this great name, coup proofing. But it's now all the rage, right? In the academic world, it's kind of strange. When I started this work, the academic world was all about economics, and that's what they thought. This is coming out of the 60s and 70s with underdevelopment and dependencia theory, right? All this kind of stuff. That was the rage. And what I was really fighting when I was doing this for my dissertation was trying to say, hey, look, yes, I agree, underdevelopment is part of this, but it's not the only thing. Now I find myself fighting the argument about politicization, because that's where academia has moved to. It's all about politicization and nothing else. It's not about economics, it's not about culture. It's just about politicization. And again, I do think politicization has a role, but the question and the way that you asked it does get at the fact that there is a role here, but it is also limited. It's not, it's hardly the only thing going on. I would actually argue it's not the most important thing going on. Right? And as you nicely pointed out, the theory would suggest that all autocracies ought to have these problems. And, at some level, I think that's true, but I think that it ranges from, incidental, right, and absolutely minor to, in some cases, truly crippling. And it's one of the reasons why, in particular in Armies of Sand, I looked at a whole range of different politicized militaries, in addition to the politicized Arab militaries, to try to really pin down, okay, where does this kind of politicization, where is it really having an impact? And where does this seem to be, something that people ascribe to politicization, especially when they're looking at the Arabs, but it's really something else going on, right? And I think that's been very important. And, first point to make is, as you've pointed out, it's just not the case that all autocracies are terrible militaries. In fact, unfortunately for humanity, some of the most competent militaries of the 20th century were the worst autocracies, right? The Nazi military, the Wehrmacht, was arguably the most competent military of the 20th century, right? And humanity suffered horrendously because of that. As I think you're well aware, the Soviet military, especially by the end of World War II, was a very effective military in its own way. It also had areas of very significant ineffectiveness, but there was a genius to the Soviet system that enabled it to overcome those problems. And some of those were problems of politicization. Others were problems of culture and economics and other things, but it did extremely well. Right. And in my book, I looked at, in particular, I did look at the Soviets, but I also looked at the Cubans and I looked at the North Koreans, both of whom performed really quite well. And I should point out, I also looked at the South Vietnamese. I looked at the Argentines. I'm getting my different factors confused there. These are all armies that ultimately are armies of autocracies that nonetheless did quite well. Right? China as well. It's simply not the case that all autocracies fight badly. In fact, as I said, there have been plenty of autocracies that fought extremely well. Now, that said, there are areas where different forms of politicization do seem to have an impact, right? And here I want to go back to something earlier I said, which is there are lots of different flavors of politicization. Again, people tend to paint with too broad a brush. When I started looking at this first, again, people talked about politicization, but what they talked about what I call Praetorianism, right? Which is military dictatorships. It's the military taking over the government and how that can warp the civil-military relations. I then came along and said, well, hey, what about when the government, when the civilians are exercising too great a control over the military? This is what I called commissarism, what Jim Quinlivan called coup-proofing, right? But I pointed out there's still another variant of politicization out there, which, I have used the very cumbersome term palace guardism, right? To simply signify sometimes a country's military has no other purpose other than to keep the government in power, right? It really wasn't built to fight other militaries, to fight foreign wars. And therefore, when it goes into combat, you really shouldn't expect a whole lot from it. Right. So first point is there are different flavors of them, and each one does create different kinds of problems for militaries, especially in extreme circumstances. Ultimately, what I'd say is that, what's really interesting is when you look across the politicized militaries, both the Arab states and the non-Arab states, what really stands out, what really emerges is how politicization tends to create severe problems at the strategic leadership level, right? It's the generals who suffer the most from politicization. If you're in a Praetorian system where the military is actually running the government, the fact of the matter is that the average troops, their life is pretty much the same. Even the junior officers, their life is pretty much the same. But it's the generals who are now fighting over, agriculture reform rather than, what's the best way to fight this country that might be thinking of attacking us, right? They get badly distracted by it. Now, that has an impact on lower levels, typically in the form of morale, right? And that's the other thing. So across the board, politicization seems to have two big impacts, one of which is poor strategic leadership, poor generalship, and the other is morale beyond that, right? In a commissariat system or coup-proofing system, again, what you get are generals who have typically been chosen for loyalty rather than competence. Now, again, even there, I don't like to push it too far. The academics who've come along and worked on this after my dissertation, I took this point. I even said, in an extreme case, you can find generals that were chosen because they were incompetent, because the political leader didn't want to have a competent general for fear that that general would overthrow them. And I had in mind Saddam Hussein, who did that before the Iran-Iraq War, right? And chose some guys to be the heads of his military who had absolutely no business, leading, a bunch of Boy Scouts on a camping mission, let alone entire armies into combat. Worth noting, he's an absolute exception, right? And again, I see the academics who kind of go off with this, they're enamored of it, and they think they see it everywhere. It is so rare. Most of the time, what you actually find is that the political leaders look for generals who are both competent and loyal, right? But the problem is, unless you've got a war going, it's hard to know who's competent, right? Think of any war in history. There are lots of generals who, go in and get washed out immediately. Either they get killed or they get relieved because they're incompetent. Right. So it's very hard to know who the competent generals are before you go into a war. So, you can usually tell who a loyal general is. So you look for loyalty and competence, but oftentimes you just get loyalty. And so in a commissariat system, you get that problem at the top, and there are others as well, but I'm just kind of pointing out some of the biggest one. And again, it is often the case that if you get a heavily politicized military like that, the folks below in the chain of command, they know it too. Right. And they're looking up and going, hey, these guys were chosen for their loyalty, not their competence. And boy, they're going to get us into a lot of trouble if we ever have to go into combat. Right. And then the last, as I said, there is that issue of the palace guard military, where, again, what matters to the leader is this military loyal to me? Right. And then are they willing to kill anyone who is going to oppose me? Right? Whether that's a lone assassin or a massive societal revolt, right? I need a military that is just going to be purely loyal to me and is going to go beat up those guys, right? And again, that tends to lead to not great strategic leadership, potentially morale problems, especially if you go up against another army and, your army knows, hey, this isn't what we signed up for, right? We signed up to beat up unarmed civilians. You want us to go fight another real military? So again, can create the same sets of problems. Right. So broadly speaking, politicization has those broad sets of impacts. And that's really, again, there's some other things out there, but those are really the major issues out there. And again, you can see those in a whole variety of different militaries. The Soviet military at the beginning of World War II certainly did have many of those problems as well. As the fighting went along, Stalin depoliticizes, is much more willing to emphasize quality over loyalty, competence over loyalty. They improved dramatically over the course of the war.
And I thought that's just coming to my head, and maybe it's completely wrong, but maybe a part of the reason is that the wars that Arab nations have largely fought in modern periods were not really existential wars. So maybe they also didn't last long enough, and there wasn't enough motivation for the leadership to really reform their militaries and remove the politicization, as, for example, Stalin did in World War II, where he really had to do it if he wanted to for his own country to survive.
Sure. So I'll restate your question to agree with it, because I think you're absolutely onto something, which is that when an Arab military, and it was often the case, was fighting a war that wasn't as existential, yes, very easy to indulge exactly that. But there's a but, and it's an important but, I guess, two. One is some of them have fought existential wars, right? Again, Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War absolutely was fighting an existential war. Saddam knew it. The Iraqis knew it, right? Very, very frightening. But, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's an exception proving the rule, which is the Iraqis did depoliticize over time. And the depoliticization of the Iraqi military is one of the most important things that happens during the war, because it does produce a much more competent Iraqi generalship, right? You get a group of generals who really know what they're doing, and an Iraqi general staff that really knows what it's doing. And they are able in 1987 and 88 to kind of cobble together a military that's just good enough to beat Iran. Right. And again, on the other side of it, when you look at the advantages that the Iraqis have, it's shocking what they had to do to beat Iran, and the fact that they just barely beat Iran, but they did beat Iran. Right. And the same thing, the Egyptians under Nasser and Sadat. And for them, it is, again, it's an existential threat, because it's ultimately about their hold on power. Right. And this is an important point to make, and again, often gets lost in this, which is that, especially in the Middle East, but I would argue for all dictators, losing wars is really dangerous. A whole lot. I mean, it's often the case that a dictator loses a war and they immediately face a challenge to their rule. Right. And that challenge to their rule typically comes with a death penalty attached. Right. And by death penalty, I don't mean, death by injection or something. I mean, you get shot by a coup. Losing wars is really, really dangerous, right? And you can think of any number of dictators throughout history, and these guys understand that, right? They don't like to lose wars. And it is, exactly as you're pointing out, Tom, it is a very important mitigating factor. It's why, as I said before, what they go looking for is not sheer incompetence attached to loyalty. Right? They go looking for competence attached to loyalty, because they have both problems. They are worried about their military overthrowing them, or again, if they are a military dictatorship, somebody else doing to them what they did to the last guy, right? But they also know that they can't afford to lose a war. So if they get into a war, and they often do, right? They often are very, very belligerent. When they get into a war, they need to win it, because losing is so dangerous for them. But you're right. That's a really important mitigating factor, which, as I said, is unfortunately often lost in a lot of the academic literature on coup proofing and politicization that we've seen in the last couple of decades.
I think on that note, maybe to point out a specific example, if it is actually important for the political leadership to not lose wars, why wasn't the series of defeats of the coalition of Arab states in wars against Israel motivating enough for them to reform their militaries so that next time they would be more successful?
Well, in some cases they do, right? And again, from my perspective, what's interesting is when they do. So is it the most important one of all was after the 6-Day War, when first Gamal Abdel Nasser and then Anwar Sadat both realize, okay, my military is not going to cut it, right? I am going to have to build a better military to defeat the Israelis, right? And they're both trying to figure out what defeat the Israelis actually means, because they understand that the Israelis are so competent that defeating them is going to be very, very difficult, right? And this is how Sadat ultimately comes up with his brilliant limited war strategy. But nonetheless, there is very much a recognition. Now, other militaries, other leaders do at different points in time recognize that they need to change. But as always, lots of buts here. First, some of them don't know what they're doing. Right. Muammar Gaddafi does get the fact that he needs to improve his military at various points in time. He just doesn't know what the hell he's doing and doesn't know how to do it. In other places, other things get in the way. So, for instance, in Syria, The domestic politics often gets in the way in terms of exactly what you're willing to do and with which units, right? So very famously, Hafez al-Assad, who is very concerned about being overthrown, very wedded to his Alawi community, very distrustful for the Sunni community. And so he'll often carve out units heavily manned by Alawis, try to reform them, right? Try to get better performance out of them, hoping that, okay, they're going to be loyal and competent. And, maybe I won't have to rely as much on this mass of Sunni units that I just don't trust nearly as much. So there are a number of instances in Arab military history where they do make an effort to try to improve combat performance, but they're hampered in various ways. And of course, for me, the biggest set of issues, and I know we're going to come to it in a moment, is again, the inability to compensate for first those underdevelopment problems that I talked about a few minutes ago, but also the cultural issues, which I know you want to get to in a moment.
Exactly. So let's get into it, because you've hinted at it, but you mostly spoke about the ways in which the culture can be a benefit. So in what ways, or what are the main factors and aspects of the Arab culture, and even saying that it is a bit of a generalizing term, what are the main aspects of it that do result in the poor military performance? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.